On the 22nd of November 1949, a commandant who ruled over a concentration camp was brought out to his execution in front of a firing squad. He would have the last say with his execution and would shout to direct the shooters himself. But Karl Peter Berg was a commander who did not serve inside of concentration camps in Germany, but he did rule over a number of sites in the Netherlands during the Second World War. He was a man who was known for carrying out a huge degree of execution inside of his camp, and under his command the living conditions of the prisoners would go downhill massively, and he was known for being responsible for the deaths of dozens of Soviet Red Army prisoners of war. But what is the story of the Nazi commandant shot by the Dutch? Join us today as we look at the execution of Karl Peter Berg, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Karl Peter Berg was born on the 18th of April 1907, but it's believed that he had a normal upbringing. However, he was attracted to the Nazi politics. He would join the party officially, but during the Second World War, Berg then joined the SS, Heinrich Himmler's paramilitary branch of the party, and he also became a member of the German military. He rose in the SS to the rank of an SS Hauptscharführer. He then was given command of his own concentration camp and transit camp based in the Netherlands. The Germans invaded the Netherlands on the 10th of May 1940, but within a week the Dutch forces would crumble, and the Germans then occupied the whole country. During the invasion there were a huge amount of paratroopers who were dropped, and these soldiers quickly overran the Dutch and left the Dutch army to be completely dominated. They knew that they could not stop the bombing aircraft that were hitting and levelling Dutch towns and cities, and with this there was a cease of hostilities and the acceptance of a German occupation. Life in the occupied Netherlands was tough, especially for those who were persecuted, and many Jews tried to hide out and flee from the Germans. Hitler did think highly of the Dutch people, but as the war went on, there was lots of starvation and suffering. Shortly after the occupation began, the Nazis began to persecute the Jews of the Netherlands, and mass deportations of people to transit camps and concentration camps then began. Karl Peter Berg would become the commandant of Camp Schul, or the Schul transit camp. This was built in 1939 as a Dutch army camp, but then following the Nazi invasion it was held for the Germans. Amongst the prisoners who were sent there were some British, French and Belgian soldiers, but then the first Jews arrived there in February 1941 from Amsterdam. These were brought here in an army truck, and they then stayed for 4 days before they were moved on to Buchenwald and then Mauthausen. Only 2 prisoners of this group then survived the war. It was a transit camp where prisoners were kept for some time before they were moved on to other death camps. But there was no labour at Camp Schul, and there was enough food to go around. But despite being at the camp a few months, the Germans shut Camp Schul, and Karl Peter Berg was then moved elsewhere, with the prisoners moving on to other sites. The camp was too small, and there was not enough room to expand, but Berg then moved on to Camp Amersfoort, and this was a concentration camp which was much larger. He was appointed as a deputy commander of the camp and served under Walter Heinrich, the commander, but Heinrich became ill, and then Berg was appointed as a deputy commander, and he then held and wielded a significant amount of power over the prisoners. Camp Amersfoort held 37,000 prisoners during the Second World War, and 650 would be killed there. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the Germans sent hundreds of Soviet prisoners of war there, and many of these were left to die in the cold winter, or they were executed in the woods near to the camp. Amersfoort was also considered a transit camp, where prisoners would be sent then on to sites such as Buchenwald and Mauthausen, where they would be killed on arrival. Despite thousands not dying here, the next destination for the prisoners would usually result in death. But inside of Camp Amersfoort, Karl Peter Berg, the deputy commander, would involve himself in the atrocities and executions of prisoners each day. He was known for mistreating prisoners, and he would appoint other brutal SS guards and staff to work alongside him. One former prisoner said of Berg's camp that, when the vans reached the camp, they emptied their passengers who were taken over by the SS guards. These began to drive them, cursing and swearing, beating them on their backs with their truncheons, into a hut, where they were to pass the night without having a meal. The hut was divided into 2 sections, one for men, one for women. It was separated from the main camp by a barbed wire fence. Altogether the camp held at that moment about 300 men, women and children. The beds were iron frames arranged in a double tier, without mattresses of any kind, Our prisoners threw themselves on the bare springs, trying to snatch a few minutes' sleep, but few slept that night, if only because the guards kept switching the lights on and off from time to time as a precaution against attempts to escape, which was next to impossible in any case. Their cold, harsh voices filled the prisoners with anxiety about the future, and in these circumstances it is anxiety which can turn a prison into hell on earth. There was a lot of violence by the guards, and the prisoners were made weak from their work, and there was little food and poor hygiene at the camp. There was illness and disease spreading around the camp, and many succumbed to these issues. Berg was a very cruel man, who is also described as a predator who derived great pleasure from the agony of others, and it was said that during roll call he loved to sneak about unnoticed behind the rows of men and catch someone in some violation, such as talking or not following orders properly. With a big grin he would then torment his victims. One of Berg's most infamous actions was appointing SS officer Joseph Katala as a camp leader, and it was said of him that, on the 23rd of December, Katala announced a ban on parcels for 3 weeks, which meant no Red Cross presents for Christmas or New Year. He further cancelled breakfast, lunch and dinner on Christmas Day itself, using the discovery of a smuggled letter as a pretext. And as an extra punishment for Christmas morning, he kept the men standing on the parade ground, which was covered with thick snow, for their roll call at 7 till 7:30 midday. A few days before, the geese for the guards' Christmas dinner had been on show, hanging on the barbed wire. Berg was involved in the executions of the camp, and he was involved in the executions of at least 77 Soviet prisoners of war, and around 200 other prisoners and inmates. Under his leadership, the living conditions of the prisoners was awful, and as the Second World War turned against the Germans, Berg tried to flee and escape any form of justice. He was then arrested and was imprisoned for a number of years, but in 1949 he was brought to trial. There are many interesting images taken of Berg in these years, and he would even be held inside of his own camp and site. He was then tried as a war criminal, and following this was sentenced to death. On the 22nd of November 1949, at the age of 42, Karl Peter Berg, one of the most evil Nazis inside of the Netherlands, was taken to a firing range in Fort Bilma. He was brought to a stake and was then tied and secured to this, but as the firing squad was readied, they stood with their rifles aimed at the former Nazi Commandant. With this, Karl Berg had one last trick up his sleeve. He screeched to the Commandant to fire himself, and he shouted at the top of his lungs, "Fire," before the officer in charge of the firing squad did, and the firing squad followed the instructions of the Nazi officer, as they were trigger-happy. He was instantly killed, and following this, Berg was then buried in an anonymous grave in Amsterdam. Karl Peter Berg was a commandant of various Nazi transit camps in the Netherlands, and he would be responsible for the conditions of the sites. His camps were known for being awful, and for the conditions being terrible, with food supplies and rations being too small. He was also a man who suffered a military death, rather than that of a war criminal, as he would be executed by a firing squad, which was considered more honourable than being taken to the gallows to be hanged. But he ordered the firing squad to shoot, and with this the executioners shot on his orders, rather than the officer in charge. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.